The bell above the door rang twice before the three officers stepped inside, and the sound of it seemed to hang in the air a moment too long, as if even the old brass knew something was wrong. Outside, the afternoon light was the color of weak tea, falling across a street that had seen better decades. And inside, the shop smelled the way it always did, of fresh bread and coffee grounds, and the faint sweetness of the candy display near the register. The lead officer set his coffee cup down on the counter, without asking, the way a man does when he believes the room already belongs to him, and he smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. He told Naomi Brooks that if she wanted her little shop to still be open next month, she would need to pay $5,000 in protection money, and he said it lightly, almost cheerfully, as though he were discussing the weather rather than a threat. A customer near the bread aisle lowered his head and studied the floor, and another near the register quietly set down the milk carton he had been holding and slipped toward the door without a word. Naomi did not raise her voice. She wiped her hands on the small towel she kept beside the register, folded it once, and set it down with the same unhurried care she gave to everything. She looked only at the badge on his chest, at the name stitched above the pocket, and she asked him, quite calmly, whether that order came from the department or from him alone. The three of them laughed, loud and easy, the laughter of men who had never once been told no, the laughter of men who had built their entire authority on the assumption that nobody would ever ask that question back. 12 hours later, the entire police department would be sealed off behind crime scene tape, evidence bags carried out in long, careful rows, and the woman they had just threatened would step out of a military helicopter wearing a rank that would make the whole state go silent. Long before any of that happened, Naomi Brooks was simply the woman who opened her shop at 6 in the morning, rain or shine, unlocking the same green door she had unlocked for 15 years, the hinges giving the same small creak they had given since the day she first hung the sign above the entrance. She remembered names the way other people remembered song lyrics, without effort, without trying, and she remembered the small details that made people feel seen, the way someone's father was recovering from surgery, the way someone's daughter had just started her first year of college, 2 towns over. She knew that Mrs. Alvarez liked her coffee dark and unsweetened. That old Mr. Fenwick always paid in exact change because he hated carrying coins home, that the teenagers from the corner apartments came in after school for the same bag of chips every single day, laughing too loudly at something on one of their phones. People in the neighborhood trusted her because she had never once, in 15 years, been caught cutting a corner or padding a price. Never once shorted a customer a nickel, even when the register was running thin at the end of a hard month. The shop was small, the shelves a little crowded, the linoleum floor worn pale in a path from the door to the counter, the register an old model that stuck if you pressed the drawer too hard. But it was hers, and it had survived when other stores around it had not, when the hardware store on the corner had closed and the laundromat 2 doors down had been sold twice in 5 years. The income was modest, barely enough to keep the lights on and the rent paid, some months requiring her to skip her own dinner so the shelves could stay stocked. But Naomi never complained, and she never let politics or gossip cross her threshold, turning conversations gently back toward the weather or the ball game whenever customers tried to drag her into an argument. In the back room, behind a stack of cardboard boxes and an old filing cabinet whose drawers no longer closed all the way, there was a small metal box that held a handful of military medals, dulled with age, wrapped in a soft cloth that had not been unfolded in years, tucked so far beneath old invoices and tax records that even she sometimes forgot exactly where it sat. Nobody in town knew what those medals meant. Nobody knew what she had done before she started stacking cans of soup and sweeping the sidewalk each morning, before the sound of her broom against concrete became as familiar to the block as the church bells 2 streets over. To them, she was simply Naomi from the shop on the corner, quiet, steady, unremarkable in the best possible way. The kind of woman people trusted precisely because she never asked to be noticed. One evening, as she was locking up, a shopkeeper from 2 doors down leaned close and whispered that this week it would be her turn. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Naomi had noticed the changes creeping through the block for months before that whisper ever reached her, the way a person notices a storm building long before the first drop of rain falls. She had seen patrol cars idling outside storefronts longer than any routine check required, had seen shop owners step outside to speak with officers in low voices, and come back inside looking smaller than when they had left. She had seen the bakery raise its prices twice in a single season for no reason anyone could explain, and she had seen the pharmacy start closing an hour earlier than it used to, its owner offering no explanation beyond a tired shrug. She had chosen, for a long while, to believe these were simply the ordinary hardships of running a small business in a town that had never had much to spare. She told herself that whatever was happening around her was not her business to interfere with, that she had left a life of interference behind her when she hung up her uniform for the last time. But the whisper on the sidewalk that evening settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she found herself standing at her own front window long after the shop had closed, watching the empty street and thinking, for the first time in years, like someone trained to notice a threat before it fully arrived. The three officers who walked through her door the following afternoon were led by a lieutenant named Rick Dalton, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched and a voice that filled a room before his body did, the kind of presence that had learned long ago that most people back down before a raised voice even finishes its sentence. Two younger officers flanked the entrance, arms crossed, blocking the exit without seeming to try, their eyes drifting lazily across the shelves as though cataloging what might be worth breaking later. Dalton called it a security fee, said it so casually that for a moment it almost sounded reasonable, the way a lie sounds reasonable when it has been repeated often enough that even the liar has stopped hearing the lie in it. He explained, almost helpfully, what would happen if she refused, ticking the possibilities off on his fingers, as though reading from a checklist he had used a dozen times before. There would be a health inspection that found violations that did not exist, a citation for something as small as a crack in the tile, or a thermometer reading a single degree off. There would be a permit review that dragged on for months, buried in paperwork that mysteriously kept getting lost. Eventually, there would be a padlock on her door, and a notice taped to the glass that nobody in the department would ever admit to signing. He told her that every other shop on the block had already paid, listing them almost proudly: the bakery, the pharmacy, the little laundromat with the flickering sign, as though their compliance were proof of his own authority, rather than evidence of a town that had been slowly strangled into silence. He said she was the last holdout, the stubborn exception in an otherwise obedient row of storefronts, and he said it like a warning, dressed up as a compliment. Naomi asked, without a trace of fear in her voice, whether there would be a receipt for the payment, and the question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The officers laughed again, that same easy laughter, and Dalton slammed his open palm down on the counter hard enough to rattle the register and send a rack of gum sliding off its hook. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and he gave her 3 days. Rick Dalton had built his authority over 11 years on the force, rising through the ranks not through skill or dedication, but through a talent for knowing exactly which superiors to flatter, and which rules could be quietly bent without consequence. He had learned early that a badge, worn with enough confidence, could open almost any door and close almost any question, and he had spent over a decade testing exactly how far that confidence could be stretched before anyone pushed back. The scheme had not begun with him, not entirely, inherited in pieces from an officer who retired 2 years earlier, and had shown him, almost as a courtesy, how the arrangement worked and who to approach first. Dalton had simply expanded it, grown greedier and bolder with each passing year, convinced that a town this small, this tired, this used to looking away, would never produce a single person willing to stand and fight. He had never once considered that the quiet woman behind the counter of the corner shop might be exactly that person, because nothing about her, not her modest clothing, not her patient voice, not the small green shop with its sticking register, had ever given him a single reason to look twice. In the days that followed, Naomi began to ask quiet questions of the people she trusted, the ones who had known her long enough to speak honestly, catching them in low voices over the counter after the shop had emptied out for the evening. What she learned chilled her. in a way that gunfire never had. A restaurant owner 2 blocks over had lost his entire life savings trying to keep up with the payments, handing over envelopes every month until there was nothing left to hand over, only to watch his restaurant close anyway when he finally ran dry and could not make the last installment. An auto repair shop had been shut down on a technicality invented on the spot, a fabricated violation scrawled onto an inspection form by a man who had never once opened the hood of a car. Its owner left standing on the sidewalk, with a business he had built over 20 years, reduced to a padlocked door and a faded sign nobody would ever read again. A hair salon on the far end of the block had quietly closed its blinds one afternoon and never reopened, its owner gone before anyone could ask why. Nobody dared to report it, because the ones who had tried before had learned quickly what silence was worth compared to retaliation. Every attempt at complaint had been swallowed by an internal affairs office that somehow, every single time, found no evidence of wrongdoing, the same 3 words appearing on every closed file, as though stamped there in advance. Naomi understood, slowly, and then all at once, walking home past darkened storefronts that had once been full of light and noise, that this was not a handful of corrupt officers skimming a little extra off the top. This was an entire system, built brick by brick, protected by silence and fear, reaching into every corner of a town too tired and too frightened to fight back. She found the restaurant owner, a heavy-set man named Walter Higgins, sitting alone in his darkened dining room one evening, chairs stacked upside down on the tables around him, and when she asked him gently what had happened, he told her the whole story, without once raising his eyes from the table in front of him. He told her about the first visit, when the amount asked for had seemed almost reasonable, and about every visit after that, when the number crept higher and the excuses grew thinner. He told her that he had gone to the city council once, quietly, and had been told to speak with internal affairs, and that internal affairs had taken his statement, thanked him for his time, and closed the file within a week, without a single follow-up call. He told her that after that, he had stopped believing that speaking up changed anything, and that he had simply kept paying, month after month, until there was nothing left to pay with. Naomi listened without interrupting, the old instinct to gather information before acting settling over her the way it always had. And when Walter finally looked up at her, his eyes tired and red-rimmed, she told him only that she understood and that she would not forget what he had told her. She left his darkened restaurant that night, carrying his story the way she had once carried classified briefings, sealed away where nothing could accidentally spill it before the time was right. That night, alone in the back room of her shop, the overhead light humming faintly, and the street outside gone quiet, Naomi knelt beside the old filing cabinet and pulled the metal box free from beneath a stack of dusty invoices. Her hands paused on the lid for a moment, the way hands sometimes pause before opening a door to a room that has been closed for a long time, uncertain whether the person on the other side of that door still exists at all. She opened the old metal box she had not touched in years. Inside, beneath the folded cloth, was not money, not paperwork, but a Delta Force beret, its fabric worn soft from years of use, its color faded but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Beneath the beret sat a handful of ribbons and a single dog tag, the edges worn smooth from being turned over and over between someone's fingers. During long nights, she no longer let herself remember too closely. She lifted the beret out and held it in both hands, and for a moment, the small back room with its cardboard boxes and broken chair seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by the memory of briefing rooms and transport planes and the particular silence that settles over a team in the last minute before a door opens onto darkness. 22 years of her life had been spent in uniform, though almost none of it had ever been spoken aloud to another living soul in this town. She had served in Delta Force, had commanded operations that never appeared in any newspaper, had led counterterrorism missions in places whose names were never printed on a map handed to civilians, missions that existed afterward only in the memories of the few people cleared to know they had happened at all. She had once led an internal investigation into corruption within her own ranks, rooting out officers who had used their authority to line their own pockets. Sitting across from men who had once called her a colleague and watching them try every excuse before the evidence closed around them, a mission that had taught her exactly how deep rot could grow when nobody was watching closely enough to notice. She had commanded hostage rescue operations, where a single wrong decision meant the difference between a family reunited and a family destroyed. Operations planned in windowless rooms and executed in minutes that felt like hours. Every choice weighed against lives she would never meet if she got it wrong. She had led coalition forces across borders that existed only on classified documents, coordinating soldiers who spoke different languages toward a single objective that could not afford to fail. Her file, if anyone in this town had ever thought to look for it, was sealed, stamped, and buried under layers of clearance most people never even knew existed. A name that appeared in exactly the kind of report nobody outside a secure briefing room was ever permitted to read. She had left the service after a final mission that had cracked something loose in her, a mission where she had watched power used not to protect but to punish, where she had seen someone with authority twist that authority into something cruel simply because nobody in the room had the courage to stop him, and she had walked away from the only life she had ever known because she no longer trusted the people who wielded that kind of authority without accountability. She had come home to build something small and honest, a shop where nobody owed her anything and she owed nothing to anyone, where the only battles she fought were against a stubborn cash register and a supplier who was always a day late. Now, sitting in the back room with the beret in her hands, the fabric soft and familiar against her palms, she made a decision as quiet and final as anything she had ever decided on a battlefield. She would not pay. In the 2 days that followed her decision, Naomi went about her routine exactly as she always had, opening the shop at 6, sweeping the sidewalk, greeting every customer by name, giving no outward sign that anything inside her had shifted at all. But quietly, in the hours before dawn, she found herself falling back into old habits she thought she had left behind for good, noting exits and sightlines the way she once noted them before every mission, cataloging which shelves offered cover and which offered none, watching the street through the front window a little longer than she used to, before turning the lock each night. She was not planning violence. She had no intention of meeting force with force. But 22 years of training did not simply switch off because a person traded a rifle for a cash register, and some part of her, the part that had once kept entire teams alive in hostile places, was already 3 steps ahead of whatever Rick Dalton believed he still controlled. The officers returned 2 days later, and this time there was no pretense of civility. Dalton walked the aisles and swept cans and boxes onto the floor with the back of his forearm, watching them scatter and roll without a flicker of concern on his face, glass jars of preserves shattering against the linoleum while he stepped over the mess as though it were beneath his notice. One of the younger officers ripped the security camera from its mount above the register, wires trailing like torn nerves, and tossed it onto the counter with a clatter that made the last remaining customer flinch. Dalton threatened to arrest Naomi on the spot, inventing a charge as easily as he had invented the health code violations, daring her to argue, his voice rising until it filled every corner of the small shop. Unknown to any of them, a customer near the back of the shop had quietly lifted a phone and begun recording, the device tucked low against a shelf, the red light hidden beneath a folded jacket, capturing every word without a single tremor in the frame. Dalton, emboldened by what he believed was total control of the room, planted his boots wide and announced to the shop at large that around here he was the law, his voice, carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence he could not talk his way around. Naomi did not fight back. She did not raise her hands, did not raise her voice, did not give him the satisfaction of watching her break, standing instead with the same stillness she might have once held during a briefing before a mission neither of them could have imagined. She only told him that he had just said something very dangerous, and something in the stillness of her voice made even Dalton pause, just for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he laughed it off and walked out with his men trailing behind him, boots crunching over broken glass. That night, after the shop was locked and the street outside had gone quiet, The neon sign of the pharmacy across the road humming faintly in the dark, Naomi sat at the small desk in her back room and wrote an email. She did not send it to a local newspaper, or a city council member, or even the state attorney general, all of whom she knew, by now, could be reached, delayed, or quietly ignored. She sent it to the Defense Criminal Investigation Service, using credentials and a case reference number that had not been active in years, but had never, technically, expired. Numbers she had memorized so long ago that her fingers typed them without her having to think. Attached to the email was a summary of everything she had learned: dates, names, patterns, the slow architecture of an extortion scheme laid out with the same precision she had once used to brief a room full of commanding officers, along with a simple request that someone with the proper clearance take a look. The response came faster than anyone in that small town could have imagined. Within hours, an analyst at the Defense Criminal Investigation Service pulled up Naomi's identity and nearly dropped the folder onto the floor, staring at a name that carried clearance levels and commendations far beyond anything a routine civilian complaint should ever touch. Her service record, once it was cross-referenced and verified, sent a quiet shockwave through the office, the kind of reaction reserved for names that were not supposed to resurface in ordinary civilian complaints, names that belonged to briefings rather than local police blotters. Calls were made and then forwarded, first to a supervisor, then further up a chain that most people never see, each new voice on the line growing more careful, more precise, as the seriousness of the matter became clear. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was looped in within the day. The Department of Defense followed soon after. The Office of the Inspector General requested a full briefing before the sun had set twice, and by the third day, a secure conference room 3 states away held a table full of officials who had never met each other before, all of them there, because of a single email sent from the back room of a corner shop. A joint task force was quietly assembled, its existence known to almost nobody outside a handful of secure offices, its purpose singular and precise. The team that gathered around the table that first afternoon included a senior agent from the Bureau's Public Corruption Division, a forensic accountant who had spent the better part of her career tracing dirty money through shell companies, and a liaison from the Department of Defense whose only job was to confirm, quietly and without fanfare, that the woman at the center of the complaint was in fact who her file claimed her to be. When that confirmation came through, delivered in a single terse line on a secure terminal, the room went still for a moment before the senior agent finally spoke, saying only that they needed to move carefully and that they needed to move fast because whatever was happening in that small town had clearly been happening for far longer than anyone outside it had realized. Investigators began pulling threads that unraveled far more than a single shakedown at a corner store. They found evidence of protection payments collected across dozens of businesses, some going back years longer than anyone had suspected. They found money laundering routed through shell accounts tied to officers' relatives, small businesses that existed on paper alone. They found extortion built into the daily rhythm of patrol routes, disguised as routine stops and courtesy checks. And they found assets, property, and cash that no honest salary could ever explain. Boats and vacation homes registered under cousins and in-laws who had never once set foot inside a patrol car. An order came down from someone whose name never appeared on paper. An order simple and absolute, put the entire department under surveillance. The plan that followed required Naomi to do something that went against every instinct she had spent years honing, and yet was, in its own way, exactly the kind of operation she had once run without hesitation. The discipline of patience and timing, settling over her, the moment the plan was set. She agreed to hand over the money. Dalton could barely contain his satisfaction when she called to arrange the drop, certain that he had finally broken the one holdout on his list, his voice loose and pleased in a way that told her he had already stopped paying attention. What he did not know was that every bill handed to him had already been marked, its serial numbers logged and cross-referenced against a database that would trace each one the moment it entered a bank. He did not know that a federal camera, mounted with the kind of precision only trained hands could manage, tucked into the awning across the street, had a clear line of sight to the exchange. He did not know that a hidden microphone, no larger than a button, sewn into the seam of Naomi's jacket, had been carrying every word he spoke directly to a room full of investigators listening in real time, headsets pressed tight, pens moving fast across notepads. Dalton took the money and folded it into his jacket with the casual confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before, counting it once with his thumb, the way a man counts something he has never once had to worry about losing. And he told Naomi, almost proudly, that nobody could touch him. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, the late afternoon light catching the edge of his badge, and asked simply whether he was certain of that. The raid came the following morning, arriving with the kind of coordinated silence that only comes from careful planning, unmarked vehicles rolling into position before the town had even finished its first pot of coffee. Federal agents moved in alongside investigators from the Department of Justice, state police units, and a team of forensic accountants who had spent the past several days tracing every dollar back to its source. Spreadsheets and account numbers laid out across 3 secure laptops in the back of a command vehicle parked 2 blocks away. The entire police department was sealed off within minutes. Officers on shift ordered to stand down and surrender their weapons, while search warrants were read aloud in the parking lot, voices flat and procedural, against the growing murmur of confusion spreading through the building. Agents moved room to room, methodically, professionally, without the chaos that Dalton might have expected from a raid he had never imagined possible. Every drawer opened, every folder cataloged, every closet checked twice. They found a hidden safe behind a false panel in the records room, its door forced open to reveal stacks of unmarked cash, more than any of them had expected, rubber-banded into bundles that had clearly never touched a bank. They found ledgers written in a code so simple it barely qualified as one, listing names and amounts and dates that matched almost perfectly with the businesses Naomi had already identified, confirming every fear she had carried since that first quiet whisper on the sidewalk. They confiscated phones, hard drives, and secret accounts that had been quietly funneling money for years, some of it traced back to a boat registered 3 counties over, some of it hidden in the name of an uncle who had been dead for 6 years. One of the younger officers, the same one who had ripped the camera from its mount above Naomi's register days earlier, sat on the curb with his head in his hands, already talking, already offering names and dates to anyone who would listen in exchange for a smaller sentence. The loyalty that had once bound the department together, dissolving the moment the handcuffs came out. Dalton stood in the middle of the parking lot, cuffed hands hanging in front of him, utterly unable to process what was happening. The certainty that had carried him through every previous threat, now nowhere to be found. He kept asking the agents nearest him who had done this, who had turned on him, as if the answer could not possibly be the quiet woman who ran the corner shop, as if a person so unremarkable could never have been the reason his whole world was collapsing around him. And then, cutting through the noise and confusion, the low rhythmic beat of rollerblades grew louder overhead, dust and grit swirling up from the cracked asphalt, and a military helicopter began its descent onto the parking lot of the department that had once believed itself untouchable. The doors of the helicopter opened, and Naomi stepped down onto the pavement, but she was not wearing the apron she wore behind her register, nor the plain clothes she wore sweeping her sidewalk each morning. She wore a dress uniform, pressed and precise, insignia, catching the morning light in a way that made several of the senior officers on scene straighten their backs and salute. Before their minds had even finished processing what they were seeing, muscle memory answering the uniform before conscious thought could catch up, Dalton stared at her, his mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face as understanding arrived far too late to do him any good. The woman he had mocked across her own counter, now standing before him, with a bearing he had seen only in training films and old recruitment posters. Naomi had never once, in 15 years, told a single soul in that town what she had done before she opened her shop, never let it slip in casual conversation, never used it to gain an advantage or command respect she had not already earned honestly through 15 years of remembering names and counting exact change. One of the lead investigators stepped forward and told Dalton, in words clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, that he had just tried to extort a woman who had once commanded some of the nation's most sensitive special operations missions, Missions that most of the men standing in that parking lot would never be cleared to read about even now. The officers standing around the parking lot, men who moments earlier had considered themselves untouchable, lowered their eyes to the ground, one after another, as if the weight of what they had allowed to happen had only just settled onto their shoulders, the silence spreading through the lot, heavier than any siren could have been. Somewhere near the edge of the parking lot, one of the older officers, a man who had served under 3 different chiefs and had grown numb to the arrangement long before Dalton ever rose to lead it, quietly told a younger colleague that he had always known this day would come, that a debt built on fear eventually comes due, one way or another. Dalton was led toward a waiting vehicle in handcuffs, his protests growing quieter with every step, the bravado that had carried him through years of quiet extortion finally failing him completely, until finally he said nothing at all. The courtroom was full on the first day of the trial, rows of benches packed with shop owners who had once been too afraid to say a word, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence they had carried for years. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, calling witness after witness, playing the recording from the night of the marked money drop, projecting photographs of the hidden safe and its stacks of unmarked bills onto a screen for the jury to study. Walter Higgins testified about the envelopes he had handed over month after month, his voice steady, even as his hands trembled slightly against the edge of the witness stand. The trial that followed did not take long, the evidence too complete and too damning for any defense to meaningfully contest. Recordings and ledgers and marked bills laid out across the courtroom in an order that left little room for argument. Dalton received a sentence that would keep him behind bars for a significant portion of the years he had left, his face unreadable as the judge read the terms aloud, and the officers who had followed his lead were convicted alongside him, each held accountable in proportion to their role in the scheme, some receiving lesser sentences, others losing their badges and their pensions in one single afternoon. The extortion network that had quietly strangled small businesses across the town for years was dismantled piece by piece, its remaining members identified and removed from the department entirely, the roster of the force rebuilt almost from scratch under new leadership, brought in from outside the county. Victims who had lost savings, lost storefronts, lost years of their lives, to the fear of retaliation, were finally compensated. Their claims processed through a fund established specifically for the case, checks arriving in mailboxes that had grown used to nothing but bad news. When the final sentence was read aloud, a quiet murmur passed through the rows of benches, not celebration exactly, but something close to relief, the sound of people finally allowed to exhale after holding their breath for years. Shops that had been padlocked for months reopened their doors, their owners standing on sidewalks they had once feared they would never see again, some of them weeping quietly as they turned their keys in locks that had sat untouched for so long. Naomi refused every interview request that came her way, turned down television crews and newspaper reporters alike, declining even the offers of small recognition ceremonies the town tried to arrange in her honor, and simply returned to her shop as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. One reporter, more persistent than the rest, managed to catch her one morning while she was restocking the shelves near the front window, notebook already open, pen already moving before Naomi had even set down the box of canned soup in her hands, and asked her directly why she had never told anyone that she had once served in Delta Force. Naomi paused, set the box gently onto the shelf, and considered the question with the same calm she had shown Dalton on the very first day he walked through her door. She told the reporter that honor was never something you wore on your uniform. It was something you carried in what you did once the uniform was gone. The reporter waited for more, pen hovering, but Naomi only smiled, picked the box back up, and returned to stacking cans in neat, even rows. The conversation closed as gently as it had opened. Naomi never spoke of what she had once been to anyone in that town, not even in the quiet weeks after the trial, when people finally understood, in broad strokes, what she had done. She never corrected the rumors that grew wilder with each retelling, never confirmed or denied the stories that spread from shop to shop about helicopters and generals and secret files. She simply let the town believe whatever version of the truth felt right to them. Content in knowing that the only version that actually mattered was the one that had kept her neighbors' doors open. In the weeks that followed, Walter Higgins reopened his restaurant with a fresh coat of paint on the walls and a new sign above the door. And on opening night, he left a single table reserved near the window, untouched, a small card resting on it that simply read, "Thank you," though he never told anyone exactly who it was meant for. The auto repair shop reopened as well, its owner standing in the doorway on the first morning with his arms crossed and a smile he could not quite hide, watching the first customer roll a battered pickup truck into the bay. The bakery lowered its prices back to what they had been 2 years earlier, and the pharmacy began keeping its old hours again, the owner no longer glancing nervously toward the door every time it opened. Slowly, the block began to breathe again, the particular kind of quiet that comes not from fear but from safety, finally settling over the storefronts one by one. The following morning arrived quiet and ordinary, sunlight spilling gently across the cracked sidewalk outside the shop, catching the dust motes drifting lazily through the front window. The bell above the door rang once as the first customer of the day stepped inside, and Naomi looked up from behind the counter and smiled the way she always had, the way she had smiled at every customer for 15 years before any of this had happened. She poured coffee for Mrs. Alvarez, dark and unsweetened, and counted out exact change for old Mr. Fenwick without being asked, his coins clinking softly into his palm the way they always had. The teenagers from the corner apartments came in after school, laughing too loudly at something on one of their phones, and bought the same bag of chips they always bought. The ordinary rhythm of the world reasserting itself one small transaction at a time. Life in the shop returned, slowly and steadily, to the rhythm it had always known, the register sticking on the same drawer it always stuck on, the same creak greeting every customer who pushed through the green door. On the wall behind the counter, where a calendar had once hung crooked and forgotten, there now hung an American flag beside a single worn beret, faded but no longer hidden away in a backroom drawer, visible now to anyone who cared to look up and notice it. Nobody who walked through that door looked at Naomi Brooks as a victim anymore. They looked at her as an ordinary woman who had quietly stood her ground and protected an entire community, proving, in the plainest way possible, that real power was never meant to intimidate. It was meant to protect.